There's been yet another diplomatic failure over the war in Syria. As the number of civilian casualties rises in eastern Aleppo, the UN has failed to agree on a ceasefire there. Russia and China have vetoed a Security Council draft resolution that would have temporarily stopped the fighting there. Russia says that a ceasefire could allow rebels to regroup and that a more long-term truce was close to being agreed with the United States, something that Washington has denied.
As
we know, these kinds of pauses have been used by fighters to reinforce their ammo and strengthen their positions. And this will only worsen the suffering of civilians. The Russian Federation cannot support this draft resolution.
Russia says that they were on the cusp of reaching a deal with the United States to allow for some resolution of the situation in eastern Aleppo, and that this resolution undermines the negotiation. That is a made-up alibi. The United States, including Secretary Kerry, has continued our bilateral conversations with Russia to try and find some way to relieve the suffering around eastern Aleppo. However, we have not reached a breakthrough because Russia has been more focused on preserving its military gains than helping Aleppo's civilians.
Nick Harper has been following the Security Council meeting from New York.
Well, New Zealand's ambassador to the United Nations summed up the inability of the Security Council to pass this resolution by saying that it would be extremely damaging to the Council's reputation and catastrophic for the people of Syria. This is the sixth time that the Russians have vetoed a Syrian resolution, the fifth time that the Chinese have done so. There were only 11 votes in favour. This resolution was aimed at creating a pause in the fighting in Aleppo to try and get the sick and injured out of the city, but also to get humanitarian aid into the city. The Russian ambassador Vitaly Churkin, though, said that the 7-day ceasefire would allow the rebels a chance to regroup and gather together more ammunition. They also said that they wanted to wait until the US and Russia had spoken, which they're likely to do on Wednesday in Geneva, about how to withdraw the rebels from Aleppo. However, the US ambassador, Michelle Sisson, said that that was a made-up alibi and that instead Russia was more focused on its military gains than helping the people of Aleppo. Once again, it does show the acrimonious nature of all of these countries, that they're unable to find any common ground, that there has been this infighting amongst them for many months.
Let's cross to TRT World's Sandra Gathmann, who is in Gaziantep on the Turkish-Syrian border. Sandra, so no ceasefire. Presumably this means that there's no let-up in fighting. What is the latest situation on the ground?
Well, Marlene, the fight for East Aleppo shows no sign of slowing. There was further heavy shelling throughout Monday in both the east and west parts of the city. Heavy aerial bombardments towards the rebel-held east, and also, as we've seen confirmed, dozens of mortars being fired into the regime-held west by rebel-held fighters in the east. Precise numbers haven't been confirmed, but the picture we're getting is of hundreds of civilians injured on either side, dozens of people killed, including one Russian nurse who was operating in a military area on the western regime-controlled side of Aleppo. In the meantime, Syrian forces and allied Shia militia have been making gains on the ground, particularly closing in on rebel-held areas of Aleppo's old city. And in those narrow streets, the fighting is intensifying. The opposition fighters, the armed rebel groups, are putting up a fierce defense. They say they won't be leaving the area. And this is really a symbolic resistance to the regime and its allies advancing in on what has been an area they've controlled for nearly 2 years now.
Sandra, we heard from the UN Security Council that Russia is saying that a ceasefire can take hold once there is this agreement, which they believe will take place between the US and Russia on getting the rebels out off Aleppo. Is that likely? And if so, what will that change on the ground?
I think, Marlene, most are in agreement that there is little hope of the fighting stopping anytime soon. The reality is, and the U.S.'s deputy ambassador put it very bleakly, that the veto of this resolution in the Security Council, the failure of a ceasefire taking hold in East Aleppo, as she put it, is a death wish on the innocent civilians. She says a failure to reach an agreement is simply going to see more blood spilled on the streets. And so it's as simple as, without a ceasefire, the fighting is going to continue. In the days leading up to these supposed talks in Geneva between the U.S. and Russia, more people are going to die in those streets. And as we know, there is an impasse. Whatever the U.S. and Russia agree in terms of seeing some opposition groups leaving East Aleppo is not going to be accepted by the opposition. Strong words coming from the Syrian National Coalition this week saying that giving up East Aleppo, retreating, is tantamount to surrender. So we can only expect that fighting to continue, the humanitarian crisis to become more acute. But the Russians are digging their heels. The fighting won't stop. A ceasefire is not going to be something they will back unless all groups retreat from East Aleppo, which doesn't seem likely, Marlene.
Okay, many thanks for that. Sandra Gathmann there in Gaziantep.